The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Sarah Holcomb's back as she struggled with the fence post. Her calloused hands, once soft and meant for pianos in her Philadelphia childhood home, now bled at the knuckles. 6 months a widow, and the ranch was falling apart around her. The cattle needed containing, the fences needed mending, and there wasn't a soul in Copper Creek willing to help the Yankee woman who'd come west with her now-dead husband. "Damn you, Thomas," she whispered, though the anger had long since faded to a dull ache. "Damn you for dying and leaving me here." She slammed the mallet against the post again, missing and striking her thumb. Pain shot through her hand, and she bit back tears that would only waste precious water. Sarah was 32, with chestnut hair streaked prematurely with grey, and eyes that had forgotten how to shine. The homestead she and Thomas had built sat a mile from where she worked now. 15 acres, a small herd of cattle, and a modest cabin that felt cavernous without him. Thomas had died from a rattlesnake bite while checking the southern fence line. By the time she'd found him, the poison had already stopped his heart. The townspeople of Copper Creek had attended the funeral, murmured polite condolences, then waited for her to sell the ranch and head back east where a woman belonged. When she didn't, their pity turned to distant curiosity, then indifference. Sarah's nearest neighbor, old man Walters, had offered to buy her land at half its worth. When she refused, he'd shrugged and said, "Suit yourself, Mrs. Holcomb. Won't be long before you're begging me to take it off your hands." The fence post finally sank into the dry earth. Sarah stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow with a sleeve already soaked through. 4 more posts to go, and the day was already half spent. The cattle would soon break through the weak southern perimeter if she didn't finish. She reached for her canteen, taking a careful sip of warm water. That's when she felt it. A presence. Sarah turned slowly, one hand instinctively moving to the small revolver holstered at her hip. Thomas had insisted she learn to shoot it, one of the few useful things he'd taught her before dying. A rider sat atop a paint horse on the ridge some 50 yards away. Even at that distance, Sarah could tell he was Apache. His long black hair hung in 2 braids, and he wore a mix of traditional clothing and what looked like cavalry pants. He carried no visible weapon, but that meant little. He simply watched her, motionless as the rocks around him. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Stories of Apache raids filled the saloons in Copper Creek. Though there had been peace for nearly 2 years since Geronimo's surrender, isolated attacks still occurred. She stood her ground, hand still on her revolver, refusing to show fear. For what seemed like an eternity, neither moved. Then, slowly, the Apache dismounted. Sarah drew her revolver, holding it steady despite her trembling arms. "That's far enough," she called, her voice stronger than she felt. The Apache made no threatening moves. He simply stood beside his horse, looking at her, then at the fence, then back at her. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, he began walking toward her, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger. "I said stop." The Apache paused, raised his empty hands shoulder high, then continued forward until he stood 10 paces from her. Up close she could see the scars on his face, one across his left cheek, another near his right eye. His eyes were dark, bottomless pools that seemed to look through her rather than at her. "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, the revolver still pointed at his chest. The Apache said nothing. Instead, he looked pointedly at the fence post she'd just set, then at the mallet in her free hand, then at the remaining posts lying on the ground. A sudden gust of wind blew dust between them, and Sarah blinked. When she opened her eyes, the Apache was kneeling beside the next fence post, examining it with careful hands. Nakohi, his name meant warrior in the language of his people, had not spoken to a white person in 3 years, not since the day he'd returned to his village to find everyone slaughtered by soldiers hunting for a raiding party that had never existed. His wife Kilea had died with their unborn child still in her womb, his mother, his younger brother, all gone. He had tracked the soldiers for weeks, killing 3 before disappearing into the mountains, where even the army scouts couldn't find him. Eventually, he'd stopped hunting soldiers, not from forgiveness, but from the hollow realization that no amount of blood would bring back what he had lost. Now he wandered, belonging nowhere. The reservation held nothing for him but slow death and shame. The white towns meant hatred and danger. So he lived between worlds, hunting when hungry, trading occasionally with Mexican settlements far from army outposts, and avoiding his own people almost as much as the whites. He hadn't meant to help the white woman with her fence. He had been watching her for days, curious about this female who worked alone on land too big for her hands. There was something in her stubborn determination that reminded him of Kailea, the way she refused to surrender even when her body trembled with exhaustion. Nakohe held the post steady as the woman hammered. She had put away her gun, though she kept it within reach. Smart woman. They worked in silence, him holding, her hammering, moving from post to post under the punishing sun. The language of work needed no translation. He noticed the blisters on her hands, the way she favored her right arm, suggesting an old injury. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheeks, but her skin retained the paleness of someone not born to this harsh land. Yet there was strength in her movements, a determination that went beyond mere survival. By mid-afternoon they had completed the fence line. The woman stepped back, surveying their work with critical eyes, then gave a small nod of satisfaction. She turned to Nakohe, studying him with the same appraising look she'd given the fence. "Thank you," she said simply. Nakohe nodded once. He turned to leave, walking back toward his horse that grazed patiently on the sparse grass nearby. "Wait," the woman called. "I have food. You're welcome to share it." Nakohe paused. The invitation surprised him. Most whites would sooner shoot an Apache than break bread with one. He turned back, seeing uncertainty in her eyes, but no fear. After a moment's consideration, he nodded again. They walked in silence to her cabin, maintaining a respectful distance. The small house was simple but solid. A main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books alongside practical supplies. A door led to what he assumed was a bedroom. Everything was orderly, clean, but with the hollow feeling of a place containing too few people. The woman busied herself at the stove, occasionally glancing over her shoulder as if to assure herself he was still there and not stealing her possessions. Nakohe stood perfectly still, watching. On a small table near the window sat a framed photograph of the woman with a tall, bearded man, her husband, he guessed. Both were smiling in the picture, their faces unmarked by the harshness of frontier life. "My name is Sarah Holcomb," she said, as she placed a plate of beans, cornbread, and jerky on the table. "My husband was Thomas. He died 6 months ago." Nakohe nodded to acknowledge her words. He understood more English than most would suspect, having learned from a missionary as a boy before the wars began. He sat at the table when she gestured to the chair, but waited for her to begin eating before he touched the food. "Do you have a name?" she asked after several minutes of silence. Nakohe considered whether to answer. Names had power. To give his would be to acknowledge a connection, however small. Yet she had offered her name freely. "Nakohe," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the sound of his voice. "Nakohe," she repeated, stumbling over the pronunciation. "What does it mean?" "Warrior," he replied, then fell silent again, focusing on his food. They finished the meal without further conversation. As dusk fell, Sarah lit an oil lamp that cast long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus. "It's getting dark," she said, clearing the plates. "There's a lean-to behind the cabin where you can sleep if you want. It's not much, but it's shelter." Nakohe considered the offer. The smart choice would be to leave, to return to the solitude that had kept him alive these past years. Yet something kept him rooted to the chair. Perhaps it was simple weariness of being alone, or maybe the ghost of his former self, the man who had once lived in a village surrounded by family, tugging at whatever remained of his heart. He nodded once more and rose to leave for the lean-to. At the door he paused and looked back at Sarah Holcomb, this strange white woman who had shared her food with an Apache. "The fence," he said. "It will not hold against the next rain. The posts need to be deeper." Before she could respond, he slipped out into the night. 3 days passed before Nakohe returned. Sarah had begun to think he never would, though each morning she found herself scanning the horizon as she went about her chores. On the 3rd day, as she struggled to repair the chicken coop, she felt that same presence again. Turning, she saw him leading his paint horse down the path to her cabin. "You came back," she said, unable to hide her surprise. Nakohe nodded, tying his horse to the hitching post. Without preamble, he walked to the tool shed, selected a hammer and saw, and set to work on the chicken coop. Sarah watched for a moment, then joined him, handing him nails when he extended his hand. They settled into a rhythm over the coming days. Nakohe would appear in the morning, work alongside Sarah until sunset, share a simple meal, then disappear to the lean-to, which she had improved with an old mattress and blankets. They spoke little, but the silence between them gradually transformed from wary to comfortable. Sarah learned to read his expressions, the slight narrowing of his eyes when something displeased him, the barely perceptible nod when a job was done well. Nakohe in turn began to understand her rhythms, how she hummed softly when lost in thought, how she squared her shoulders before tackling a difficult task. 2 weeks after his first appearance, Sarah found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why are you helping me?" They sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood between them, Thomas's last bottle, which Sarah had never had the heart to open until tonight. Nakohe took a small sip from his cup, considering her question. The whiskey burned pleasantly in his throat. "Your husband," he said finally. "How did he die?" "Rattlesnake," Sarah replied, surprised by the question. "He was checking the southern fence line." Nakohe nodded as if this confirmed something. "My wife died 3 years ago. Soldiers came to our village while I was hunting." Sarah's breath caught. "I'm sorry." She was carrying our child. The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not just for his loss, but for her own. She had never told anyone, not even the doctor in Copper Creek, that she had been 2 months pregnant when Thomas died. The stress and grief had taken the baby a week later. "I lost a child too," she whispered, "after Thomas died." Nakohe's eyes met hers, recognition of shared pain passing between them. He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed more understanding than words ever could. "The land does not care who works it," he said after a long silence. "Apache or white woman, it takes the same sweat from both." It wasn't a direct answer to her question, but Sarah understood. They were two people adrift, finding momentary anchor in shared work and shared loss. The following morning, Sarah woke to the sound of horses, multiple horses, approaching the cabin. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to see 3 riders from town. Nakohe was nowhere to be seen, though his horse remained tied behind the lean-to. "Morning, Mrs. Holcomb," called Elijah Walters, the son of her nearest neighbor. Beside him rode the shopkeeper, Mr. Finch, and Sheriff Taylor. None of them looked pleased. "Gentlemen," Sarah acknowledged, her hand instinctively moving closer to the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Been hearing some strange tales," Sheriff Taylor said, dismounting. "Folks say you've got yourself an Indian helper. Apache, they're saying." "What I do on my property is my business, Sheriff," Sarah replied coolly. "It becomes my business when there's an Apache warrior roaming free, ma'am," the sheriff countered. "Army's got standing orders about hostiles outside the reservation." "He's not hostile," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. "He's been helping me with repairs." Elijah Walters spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Helping himself to more than repairs, I'd wager," he sneered. Sarah's face flushed with anger. "You watch your mouth, Elijah Walters." "Or what?" Walters laughed. "Your savage boyfriend gonna scalp me?" Sheriff Taylor raised a hand. "That's enough, Elijah." He turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Holcomb, I understand your situation is difficult, but harboring an Apache is dangerous. Not just for you, but for everyone in Copper Creek. I'm going to have to ask you to tell me where he is. And if I refuse, then I'll have to search your property," the sheriff said, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. Before Sarah could respond, a voice spoke from behind the cabin. "No need to search." Nakohe stepped into view, his hands empty and held slightly away from his body. The 3 men immediately drew their weapons. "Don't move, Injun," Sheriff Taylor ordered. "He's not armed," Sarah said quickly, stepping between Nakohe and the men. "And he's done nothing wrong." "Step aside, Mrs. Holcomb," the sheriff said firmly. "This doesn't concern you." "It's my property," Sarah insisted, "and he's here at my invitation." Mr. Finch, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "Sarah, be reasonable. What would Thomas say if he could see you now, defending an Apache?" "Thomas is dead," Sarah said flatly, "and I'm alive because this man has helped me keep this ranch going when not one of you offered a hand." Sheriff Taylor's expression softened slightly. "I understand you're grateful, ma'am, but there are laws. The Apache need to stay on their reservation unless they have proper papers from the Indian agent." "Does he have papers?" Sarah looked at Nakohe, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I thought not," the sheriff sighed. "I'm sorry, but I'll have to take him in." "And then what?" Sarah demanded. "Hand him over to the army? We all know what that means." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Everyone knew stories of Apache prisoners who never reached the reservation, killed while attempting to escape. Mrs. Holcomb, Sheriff Taylor said quietly, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah felt Nakohe's hand on her shoulder. She turned to look at him, surprised by the touch. It is all right, he said softly. I will go. No, Sarah whispered fiercely. They'll kill you. A ghost of a smile touched Nakohe's lips. Perhaps, perhaps not. He stepped forward, hands still visible. Sheriff Taylor immediately moved to secure him, but Nakohe spoke again. One moment. He looked directly at Sarah. The north pasture needs water. The creek can be diverted with rocks. It was such an ordinary statement, so practical amidst the tension, that Sarah almost laughed through her tears. She nodded, understanding that he was still trying to help her survive even now. I'll remember, she promised. Sheriff Taylor bound Nakohe's hands and led him to a spare horse. As they prepared to leave, Sarah called out, Sheriff, I expect to hear that he arrived safely at the reservation. I'll be checking. The sheriff met her gaze for a long moment, then nodded curtly. You have my word, Mrs. Holcomb. As they rode away, Sarah stood on her porch, fists clenched at her sides, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Then she went inside, took Thomas's revolver from its hiding place, and began cleaning it with methodical precision. 3 days passed with no word from town. Sarah threw herself into her work, diverting the creek as Nakohe had suggested, mending chicken coops and reinforcing fences. Each night, she collapsed into exhausted sleep, only to wake with her heart pounding from dreams of Nakohe dead in the dust or locked away on the reservation, his spirit dying a slow death. On the 4th morning, Sarah hitched the wagon and headed to Copper Creek. The town's single street was quiet as she tied her horses outside the sheriff's office. The door was locked, a note indicating Sheriff Taylor would return the following day. Sarah crossed to Finch's general store, where a small bell announced her entrance. Mrs. Finch looked up from her ledger, her smile fading when she recognized Sarah. Mrs. Holcomb? She acknowledged stiffly. Mrs. Finch, Sarah returned with equal coolness. I need supplies. As Mrs. Finch gathered the items on Sarah's list. Sarah asked casually, has the sheriff returned from taking that Apache to the reservation? Mrs. Finch's hands paused briefly over a sack of flour. I wouldn't know about such things. Strange, Sarah persisted. It's not a long journey. He should have been back by now. Perhaps you should ask Mr. Walters, Mrs. Finch suggested, her tone deliberately neutral. I believe he accompanied the sheriff part of the way. Sarah's blood ran cold. Old man Walters had made no secret of his hatred for the Apache, blaming them for his eldest son's death years earlier. If Elijah had gone with the sheriff and Nakohe, she paid for her supplies and left the store, steering her wagon not toward home, but to the Walters ranch. The sprawling property lay just beyond the town limits, its cattle grazing on land that seemed suspiciously similar to what Thomas had once described as their western boundary. The main house came into view, a 2-story structure that spoke of prosperity built on others' misfortune. Sarah drove directly to the front, not bothering with the customary approach to the back door expected of women traveling alone. Elijah Walters sat on the porch, cleaning a rifle. He looked up with surprise that quickly turned to amusement. Well, if it isn't the Apache lover, he drawled. What brings you to civilized country, Mrs. Holcomb? Sarah ignored the taunt. Where is he, Elijah? Where's who? Walters set aside his rifle and stood, walking to the edge of the porch. You know exactly who. Nakohe, the Apache that Sheriff Taylor was taking to the reservation. Oh, him. Walters smiled unpleasantly. Afraid there was an incident on the trail. Tried to escape from what I heard. Sheriff had no choice. Sarah's hands tightened on the wagon reins. You're lying. Am I? Walters descended the porch steps, moving closer. Why do you care so much about one dead Indian, Mrs. Holcomb? There are plenty of real men in Copper Creek who'd be happy to help a widow for the right considerations. His implication made Sarah's skin crawl. Where is Sheriff Taylor now? Had business in Tucson. Won't be back for a few days. Walters was close enough now that Sarah could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour, which means there's no one to hear you scream, should you decide to be difficult. Sarah reached for her revolver, but Walters was faster, grabbing her wrist in a painful grip and yanking her from the wagon. She fell hard onto the dirt, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. I've been patient, Walters snarled, standing over her. Waited for you to realize you can't make it on your own. That land should be ours, and you know it. Your husband stole it from my father with that phony deed." "The deed is legal," Sarah gasped, struggling to her feet. "Registered in Tucson. Paperwork can disappear," Walters said, reaching for her again, "just like troublesome widows who don't know their place." Sarah backed away, her hand finally finding her revolver. She drew it, pointing it steadily at Walter's chest. "Don't touch me again," Walters laughed. "You won't shoot me." "Try me," Sarah said, cocking the hammer. For a tense moment, they faced each other, neither blinking. Then a voice called from the direction of the barn. "Elijah, Pa wants you." Walters glanced toward the voice, then back at Sarah. "This isn't over," he promised quietly. "Not by a long shot." "Tell me what happened to Nakohe," Sarah demanded. "The truth." Something flickered in Walter's eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or triumph. "Your Apache friend won't be helping you mend fences anymore. That's all you need to know." He turned and walked toward the barn, leaving Sarah standing alone, the revolver still raised in her trembling hand. The ride home passed in a blur of grief and anger. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If Walters and the sheriff had killed Nakohe, there would be no justice, no reckoning. Just another Apache dead at white hands, forgotten by everyone except a widow who had briefly known his quiet strength. As she approached her property, the setting sun cast long shadows across the land. Sarah was so lost in thought that she almost missed the figure sitting on her porch. She pulled the wagon to an abrupt halt, her heart thundering in her chest. Nakohe rose as she scrambled down from the wagon. He looked thinner, with fresh bruises on his face and a crude bandage around his left forearm, but undeniably alive. "How?" Sarah began, then stopped, afraid that speaking might shatter this miracle. "Sheriff Taylor is not an evil man," Nakohe said simply. "He let me go once we were far from town." Sarah stepped closer, still disbelieving. "Walters said you were dead." "Walters sees what he wishes to see." There was something different in Nakohe's voice, a new weariness perhaps, or a resolve that hadn't been there before. "Will they come looking for you?" Sarah asked. "Eventually." Nakohe gazed out at the land, the cattle grazing in the distance, the newly diverted creek sparkling in the last rays of sunlight. "But not tonight." Sarah followed his gaze, seeing her ranch through his eyes, the vulnerability of it, but also its potential. "I can't do this alone," she admitted, the words painful but necessary. "The land, it's too much for one person." "Yes," Nakohe agreed. "The land demands more." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Sarah understood what he was offering. Not romance. They were both too broken for that, too haunted by their lost loves, but partnership, a joining of strengths against a world that had taken everything from them both. "Stay," she said simply. "Help me make this place work. We'll split everything equally." Nakohe considered her words. To stay meant danger, from men like Walters, from soldiers who might come looking for him, from a society that would never accept what they were building here. But to leave meant returning to the emptiness, the wandering, the slow death of purpose. "Yes," he said finally, "I will stay." As darkness fell across the land, they sat side by side on the porch, not touching, not speaking, but united in the quiet knowledge that sometimes survival means finding strength in the most unexpected places. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, fences to mend, battles to fight, a hostile world to face. But tonight, for the first time since they had each lost everything, neither was alone. The coyotes began their evening chorus, their cries echoing across the valley. Above them, stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, ancient and indifferent to the small dramas of human lives below. Yet somehow, in their cold light, two broken people had found a reason to continue, not in love, not yet, but in something equally powerful, the recognition of shared determination, of mutual respect, of two souls who understood that sometimes the greatest act of defiance against a cruel world is simply to survive it, side by side.